So my talk today will be structured around understanding the importance of aquatic terrestrial linkages, also ecosystem benefits of riparian wooded zones. And then I will introduce a new project we just got funded from the Norwegian Research Council using nature-based solutions, which in many ways probably will be able to specifically counteract a lot of the impacts that we do experience. As Guy was alluding to in his talk, it might be very difficult. You certainly don't change climate. The changing climate will not be easily changed. And also the invasion of Pacific pinks. You probably have to do other stuff, other things, and this could be partly found in nature-based solutions. Then I will touch upon the Pacific salmon. Is it all bad, really? What do we know? It's a really good follow-up of the great presentation from before, and then I will try and round up with some conclusions. So embedded in a lot of the work that is done in the Six Rivers projects are this clear interlinkage between the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. It's a transfer of resources across what was formerly known as the ecozone or the transition zone between the two systems, and we have input from the terrestrial zone going into feeding the aquatic food webs, emergence from the aquatic food webs that would feed into the terrestrial ecosystem. And the more uninterrupted this linkage is, the more natural the wider ecosystem will be, because we have to remember that a river is not just a river is embedded in its floodplain, and again, the river and its floodplain are based in a catchment, and all this will have significant impact on the ecological conditions in that river, and then in the end on the Atlantic salmon, which is our interest in this conference. I've also presented this the last time. I have a little bit of new data this time around, but one thing that you could consider and also considered in this project is the use of wooded riparian vegetation to promote, you could say, the ecosystem as such, and ecosystem functioning to the great sort of benefits of secondary producers such as salmon. So we did a fairly small, limited study on riparian areas. We used 9 sites where it was embedded in a larger study. But what I'm showing here is that we looked at pairwise reaches of rivers with and without riparian buffers. They were very close in proximity, so there was no barriers to migration or dispersal between them of any types of organisms. These were situated in the Oslo Basin, so they were urban, peri-urban. That's why also some of them had to be taken out because they were too polluted. It's not relevant in this context. But there's quite a good salmon run in Oslo. There's most of the rivers actually have salmon and a good trout population. So it's an interesting system in this context as well. It's though mainly Salmotruta, or the trout, that was dominating in the streams we looked at. We did a lot of different types of sampling, and I will only touch upon the few things that we've done. And this relates to these 2 curves, which is based on, we used not gut content, but we used stable isotopes. And what we see here is that the buffered are the green ones, the green dots, and the open, unbuffered here are sort of the orange. And on the y-axis is, on the x-axis, sorry, is the delta carbon signal, and what that basically shows you is the more depleted it is, the more the production is coming from in the river, autochthonous. The more heavy isotopes, the more it is coming from the brown pathway or from the terrestrial ecosystem. They're really distinctive between the 2 sites. And we see here that, furthermore, the green here is the density of fish. And you see that there are a higher density of this mid-sized fish when we go into the buffered reaches compared to the open reaches. And you see here that we have the buffered up here in the more enriched carbon signal. So clearly, this is transferred into the food web, and the organic carbon from the terrestrial ecosystem plays an important role. So if we look at this a little more conceptual, we can see here that overall we had a higher density of salmonids in the buffered reaches. And this could be multiple effects. It can also be that there was slightly more habitat, as we discussed on earlier. So it wasn't overly strong, but it was always consistent. But what we believe is happening is that when you have the no buffered zones in this system, you will have smaller sized chironomids that feed on algae, and they feed the mid-sized fish. In the brown web or the buffered, you would have the CPOM, the leaves, that will feed large-sized caddis, which is a really good food item for the mid-sized trout. And this is the way of transfer. We believe that this is a much more efficient transfer of energy compared to the predation of many small chironomids. So this is also, to our belief, why you see more, or we do see more fish in the buffered reaches, is also because they actually have a much better provision of food. And we suggest that this would have an implication for secondary production. When we get up to the larger fish, we don't see any clear signal, which is not surprising, because these will move around. They are much more mobile. They will move around. They will predate on fish from the system, so that actually the larger fish you do not pick up a strong signal either from the brown or what we call the green pathway. So this strongly suggests that there is this direct link from the buffers to the fish and the fish production. And again, we have a much higher diversity, of course, of macroinvertebrates, so we have quite a number of these big case caddis, and they really they do favor these areas with a large input of CPOM. Okay, so if we look at a model, this is not all the data I've shown, but we look at the model ecosystem, when we look at the riparian zones, we have two effects. So the main positive effect, as we see it, comes through the food source into the food web. So it's from the allochthonous input of the leaves that do feed macroinvertebrates and do feed also large-bodied macroinvertebrates, even though they are not predatory. Another issue is that we see that shaded conditions do promote diatoms which have a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, which cannot be generated in the terrestrial ecosystem. This is why we eat the pills and we eat the salmon. So there's much more omega-3 in the shaded sections than in the open sections in our system. And this leads to a very high quality food when you have the buffer conditions. But also, as we've been seeing early on, we have the terrestrial direct subsidies, which sometimes is important, sometimes not important. It depends, but you have more terrestrial subsidies. And then, of course, that was also discussed earlier, you also have this habitat benefits. So it provides direct physical habitats, the wood, the large wood, and you also have the shading, especially in areas where we are working. You can have pretty warm summers in the Oslo area, and there it's really good to have the shading to keep down the temperature. And for just touching upon what was discussed in the last session, I don't think that the average temperature is necessarily a problem here. The problem is the extremes, and they are getting more frequent. And if you have very low water level, even in a cold area, and a surprisingly warm summer, then you can have big issues for salmonids, even quite far north. So we have to try and reduce these extremes, and I think that the buffer zones do actually provide something there. Okay, so this is my input about the nature-based solutions. So I have a background in restoration ecology, so it was all about river restoration, and we were doing it for many years, and that's great. I mean, but the wider concept is that you can do much more on different scales as a nature-based solution. So restoration is a nature-based solution. It just depends on the scale. The important issue here is that you have something that are very far from a natural system that will need to be maintained. You try to prevent and manage things. Here is the management component, but you know that you would need to sustain it. Sometimes you have to mimic, you have to construct something to like a passable barrier or something, but it's not really nature. You construct it to increase spawning upstream. and then you have the natural systems where they just need a notch, and then they should be self-maintained, where you can create and improve. Here you would see the riparian buffers, which have been lost in many places. They would be able to be restored, and they would have a lot of knock-on effects. And then, of course, you have the natural ecosystems, which also provide a lot of services, but it can also be viewed as a nature-based solution, and for this reason, they should be protected. So, this is the project that we've just got awarded, which is Safeguarding Biodiversity, Improved Climate Adaptation and Catchment Under Pressure, Tools and Solutions, short SBICAS. It's quite a big project from the Research Council that is going to run over the next 4 years. And the whole idea behind this project is to use these nature-based solutions, which is from riparian buffers, floodplains, and connected wetlands are all extremely important for many reasons. The wetlands, not least for their ability as a carbon sink, and our suggestion is that they are key areas for biodiversity, safeguarding biodiversity, but they also have enormous climate adaptation potential. And we want in this project to understand what are the conditions that are optimal for nature-based solution. How can we optimize them in a way that we can achieve something that we want, like sustaining salmonid population, improve salmon. And this is going to be predicted on the catchment scale, because it's not, as I said early on, it's the river, it's floodplain, but it's also within the catchment. And we all know that it's not, you have to put the measures in the right places. Otherwise, you are not likely to have the benefits that you otherwise would have. So you have a lot of benefits from restoring wetlands or having wetlands in upstream areas. They would retain water. You have a lot of positives of connecting floodplains lower down, because there you can have a lot of water stored. And for the riparian buffers, this is really important along smaller rivers, small streams, because this is where you have the highest degree of connectance. This is where you can benefits of lower temperature and so forth. So all this needs to be seen at a larger spatial context. Otherwise, we do fail to take efficient measures. So this is actually the main idea about this project, and we'll end up in an optimization model that will all try and predict where in the catchment should I put my nature-based solutions. And this can be used here, it can be used everywhere. It's not really limited to any geographical area. This one is, as you can see from the land uses, not the northeast of Iceland, but it's in the context of Norway. Okay. So, the Pacific pink, my take. This has been an outcry this summer. It's been absolutely one of the biggest news stories in Norway over summer, has been the enormous invasion of Pacific pinks, which has never been more. This is actually myself catching one in its natural home range, Glacier National Park in Alaska, some years back. And I mean, it was before I ever knew that this would be a big hot topic. So this is from our counterpart to the BBC, the Norwegian National Radio and Television. And this is from the stream I think you mentioned early on. This is a small stream. They removed over nearly 9,000 salmon this summer from where they do what is in Norwegian called a dugnad, which means that everyone goes out and do something together. You have it everywhere in Norway. People meet up in the local football club or where they live in the local community, and they do something together. And now this pukkellaks, pink salmon, is the big thing. And you can see here it's really engaging people. A lot of work. And I think this is great to see this. But also, as scientists and as ecologists, not least, we have to try and look at the wider perspective, I think. So this is a repetition of what we just saw, but just to say that there was one thing that is very striking, and that is that they were very evenly spread along the Norwegian coast in 2017. In 2019, they increased enormously in the north, up with Tana as well, but they sort of didn't really go further down south. And the same pattern is seen this year. Of course, we don't have the data. The river I saw before, they estimate there's about 15,000 pink salmon going up, small river, and the natural population of Atlantic salmon is only 4,000. So just the scale of this is quite enormous. But is it all bad? I mean, it's not because I want to start a discussion here, but there's been really great recent studies done by Kathy Dunlop that works in the Norwegian Marine Research Institute in Tromsø in the north, where she looked at the same patterns that you have seen in the Pacific. So as Guy was saying, in the Pacific they are keystone species. They are extremely important for the terrestrial ecosystem and for other parts of the aquatic ecosystem because of the life cycle of these Pacific salmon. So what she suggests here is that there could be some positive effects. So what they found was that the native salmonids, trout and Atlantic salmon, actually ate eggs from the Pacific when they came up to spawn. And they could see these, you could see these are especially the large. This is during the spawning of the pink salmon, and then the guts of the salmon and the trout. You have the most common food item in the gut content analysis is eggs from pink salmon. They could also track it down. They could track the marine signal or the signal down into the fish after the season in some places. It was not very strong, but look at this year when there's so many pink salmon now. Would this actually be a subsidy to the native food web in a way that we couldn't really foresee, especially as maybe other food resources are more limited? So it opened up a lot of questions about the possible impacts. Another thing that goes back to what I discussed about riparian zones is that this is not a nice slide at all, so I'll just tell you what to look at. Basically, this is from a summer period. They put out a lot of carcasses, different sizes, along one river, and then they looked at the scavengers that came to eat it. And it was a really good mix. They were removed almost every day. The marine-derived nutrients are taken into the riparian zone by crows, by red foxes, by whatever is there, and of course are increasing the nutrient level. So this might be very unlucky if you already have an issue with nutrients, but if you have an area which is really significantly nutrient limited, this might to some degree have a positive effect. Just a suggestion, exactly as you see in the Pacific. This is not, by the way, pink salmon. This is just a nicer picture. This is the Chinook, or not the Chinook, it's the red salmon. But what you could ask, or we should ask ourselves, is that the direct effects of pink salmon are currently unknown, and clearly there needs to be a lot of research into this. Because it's in just the sheer amount of pink salmon going up now makes it really, it seems so extremely likely that there would be some kind of negative interaction. However, as we also saw in the previous talk, the difference in the life cycle don't suggest a really strong overlap in the river system. But it might be in the coastal areas, it might be elsewhere there is a strong interaction. But in the river system, it might be limited. And then indirectly, it might be so that in some rivers at least, these pink salmons could stimulate the overall productivity, maybe go into the native food web and be of a benefit in some places. Again, this is all about a balance, I think, but we have to view this issue from both sides, and I think this is important. But if you go into the slide of Norway, this is the last, this is the threats in Norway. Actually, quite a lot of the 400 salmon rivers are in a fairly good condition in Norway as such. But the big issues here are related to farmed salmon, which is sort of a really significant issue, and this is still seen as the strongest likely negative impact on native salmon populations. Then you have the hydropower, especially, or the habitat change, but very close to this, you have the pink salmon here. And the pink salmon is maybe moving up this direction. So it's really urgent that we do try as scientists and the community interested in Atlantic salmon or or these river systems to try and investigate what are the main issues, and how can we tackle it in a good way. Because even though I enjoy seeing people in a community unite, going out fishing, I'm sure they will not get rid of the pink salmon this way. I'm sure we need to do something. We need to do something more if we want to get rid of the pink salmon, if we cannot incorporate them within the ecosystem in some kind of capacity. So I think it's, for me, it's first of all, I have to acknowledge Edvard Munch. He was very interested in metabolism. I think that should be your favorite artist guy, because he saw this 1890. You see it now, 2020. But he saw this, that, I mean, the pregnant woman staring up into the sun on the bones of the ancestors. This is how it all links. And this is actually how it links. It's very a nice metaphor. But it's important to understand the entire ecosystem. I think we've shown this throughout, and I think the work that are being done now in the Six Rivers projects are really pointing into that direction. I also think that it's important to look into ecosystem function as the endpoint rather than maybe species diversity or something else, especially when you look into riparian buffers, because in many ways we want to create the best possible circumstances for getting energy through the system so that we can have a good recruitment of salmonids. Wooded riparian buffers have a lot of benefits outside, in addition to the ones that they might have to fish. They increase denaturfication. They have a lot of positive implications. They strengthen the overall biodiversity. So it's a very powerful tool, I think, for the future to look into this wherever they have been depleted for different reasons. And I think the nature-based solutions, this is one component of the nature-based solution, but that could be used much more actively. And everyone that applying for money now knows that there has to be nature-based solutions in every second word. But it's probably a good thing. It's a good way forward. And a lot of us that have been working with this type of issues, not least restoration, will be very well equipped to go into the nature-based solution discussion. And then I think the effect of an invasive species, just because I got a bit interested in this, is you have to see it again in the ecosystem, through the ecosystem lens. You have to see the wider perspective. So thank you.